By the start of 1778, the American War for Independence had dragged on for nearly 3 years, and the Continental Army had hit its lowest point yet. At Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, George Washington's soldiers faced brutal conditions: too little food, too few supplies, and crowded, unsanitary camps that bred disease. Men were dying at an alarming rate, by some estimates, 10 to 15 a day. Washington repeatedly begged Congress for money, manpower, and provisions, but the fledgling government simply couldn't keep up. The army was shrinking before his eyes, and Washington warned Congress bluntly: without help, his men would either starve or scatter. It was becoming clear to American leaders that survival meant finding outside help, and fast. Courting France. Throughout the 1700s, European powers often treated a rival's enemy as a natural friend, and nowhere did that logic apply more than with France, Britain's oldest imperial rival. An alliance with France made obvious strategic sense, so the fledgling United States sent one of its most famous citizens, Benjamin Franklin, to Paris. Franklin was already a celebrity across Europe, a scientist, a seasoned traveler in London society, and a capable French speaker who understood European diplomacy better than almost any other American. He was, in short, the ideal man to make the case for American independence to a skeptical French court. France had every reason to want to see Britain humbled. A rupture in the British Empire was tempting, especially after France's own humiliating defeat in the 7 Years' War. Still, King Louis XVI hesitated. A formal alliance with rebellious colonists was a serious gamble, and many in the French court doubted the Americans could actually win. While Franklin worked the halls of Versailles, ordinary French citizens were already taking action. Chief among them was a young nobleman, the Marquis de Lafayette. Raised in wealth and married into one of France's most powerful families, Lafayette had nonetheless embraced Enlightenment ideas about liberty and citizenship, ideas that had little room to breathe under France's rigid aristocracy. To him, the American cause represented something bigger than a colonial squabble, a chance to advance liberty everywhere. Defying his family and his king, Lafayette disguised himself, slipped across the Pyrenees, and sailed to America, where Congress, impressed by his wealth and enthusiasm, made him an honorary general and attached him to Washington's staff. He quickly became something like the son Washington never had. The turning point came after the American victory at Saratoga in late 1777. That win gave Franklin the leverage he needed. In February 1778, France and the United States signed a formal treaty of alliance. America gained access to French ships, troops, and money. France got a shot at revenge against Britain. What had been a colonial rebellion instantly became a global war. A world war erupts. King George III now faced a genuinely global crisis. North America was valuable, but it was hardly Britain's most profitable possession. The sugar-producing islands of the Caribbean generated far more revenue than all of American tobacco combined. With France now in the fight, Britain had to spread its forces thin, redirecting thousands of troops away from North America to defend Caribbean holdings instead. For Washington's starving army at Valley Forge, word of the French alliance arrived like a lifeline. After 5 brutal months and roughly 2,000 deaths from disease and exposure, the news brought overwhelming relief. Washington organized a celebration: cannon salutes, cheers for the King of France, rations of rum, and declared a day of thanksgiving. But celebration didn't change daily reality. French troops were still far away, and France's war priorities lay elsewhere, from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. Behind the scenes, women who traveled with the army, cooking, nursing, cleaning, and keeping morale afloat, were quietly indispensable to keeping the Continental Army alive through the winter. Discipline arrives at Valley Forge. Help also came in an unexpected form. A Prussian officer named Baron von Steuben, a friend of Franklin's who arrived at Valley Forge determined to turn untrained farmers into a real fighting force. Training sergeants and corporals directly, Steuben drilled the army in European-style tactics, how to march, maneuver, and fight shoulder to shoulder. His thickly accented mix of English and German confused as many soldiers as it taught, but his results were undeniable. It later emerged that Baron von Steuben wasn't actually a general at all, just a former captain, but by then, no one much cared. The army that emerged from Valley Forge that spring was dramatically more disciplined than the one that had entered it. Monmouth and the Southern Shift. That new discipline was tested in June 1778 at the Battle of Monmouth, fought in sweltering heat as British forces marched from Philadelphia to New York. Roughly 14,000 Continental troops faced 11,000 British regulars. Amid the chaos, stories emerged of women stepping directly into combat roles, the most famous being Molly Pitcher, likely a composite of several real women who carried water to soldiers, and in some cases, manned artillery when male gunners fell. The battle ended without a decisive victory, but it proved something important. American troops could now stand and trade fire with British regulars instead of fleeing. Realizing time was against them, the British shifted strategy toward the American South, where large enslaved populations and divided loyalties seemed to offer an opening. Beginning in 1778, British forces invaded Georgia, capturing Savannah with crucial help from enslaved guides who knew the region's swamps and waterways. In 1779, British commander Henry Clinton went further, promising freedom to any enslaved person who escaped from a rebel-owned plantation to British lines, a policy that drew thousands seeking liberty, even as it stopped well short of ending slavery itself. The Southern War quickly devolved into a brutal civil conflict between American loyalists and patriots, marked by ambushes, reprisals, and destroyed homes. In 1780, the British scored their biggest victory yet, capturing Charleston, South Carolina, and with it thousands of Continental soldiers. Betrayal and retaliation. As British success mounted, one of America's most talented generals, Benedict Arnold, grew bitter over being passed over for promotion and buried in debt. Secretly, he began feeding information to the British and eventually schemed to hand over the critical fortress at West Point in exchange for money and a British military commission. The plot unraveled when his British contact, Major John Andre, was captured with incriminating documents. Arnold fled to the British side, and his betrayal became one of the war's most devastating psychological blows to the American cause. He later led British raids through Virginia, torching plantations, including Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, and helping enslaved people their escape to British lines. Nations within the war. The Revolution wasn't only a fight between Britain and its colonies. It also reshaped the fate of native nations across the continent. Long before 1775, indigenous confederations like those led by the Ottawa leader Pontiac had already resisted British expansion west of the Appalachians, prompting Britain's 1763 proclamation line restricting colonial settlement, a line American colonists deeply resented and routinely ignored. When war broke out, native nations faced an impossible choice: back Britain, back the fledgling United States, or attempt neutrality, which frequently proved impossible to maintain. The Cherokee, led by War Chief Dragging Canoe, allied with Britain and launched raids on frontier settlements, only to face a devastating American counterattack that destroyed roughly half their towns and stripped them of millions of acres. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, Iroquois, split internally, with most nations siding with Britain under Mohawk leader Joseph Brant, while others, including the Oneida, aligned with the Americans. Washington responded with a scorched earth campaign so severe that Haudenosaunee people began calling him Town Destroyer. Even communities that fought alongside the Americans, like the Stockbridge Mohicans, suffered devastating losses. The Yorktown Campaign. By 1781, Britain's southern strategy had pushed deep into Virginia, and British General Lord Cornwallis fortified a position at Yorktown, expecting naval support. Washington, still fixated on retaking New York, was persuaded by his French counterpart, General Rochambeau, that a strike against Cornwallis in Virginia offered a better chance at a decisive victory. Combining forces, the two generals marched a 19,000-strong Franco-American army roughly 450 miles south, all while deceiving British commanders in New York into believing an attack there was imminent. The plan worked. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse defeated the British Navy at the Battle of the Chesapeake, cutting off Cornwallis's escape route by sea. Trapped between Lafayette's forces on land and the French fleet at sea, Cornwallis was surrounded. After weeks of siege, during which Cornwallis, running low on supplies, forced out formerly enslaved people who had sought protection with his army, including many suffering from smallpox, his position collapsed. On October 19, 1781, nearly 8,000 British troops surrendered at Yorktown. Peace and an uncertain legacy. Yorktown didn't instantly end the war, but it broke Britain's political will to continue fighting. Facing enormous debt and declining public support, Britain began negotiating peace, and the Treaty of Paris was signed in September 1783, granting the United States independence and a surprising amount of Western territory stretching to the Mississippi River. That December, Washington did something few military leaders in history had done. He voluntarily resigned his command and returned to civilian life, reinforcing the principle that military power would answer to civilian government. But peace brought no resolution for everyone. Loyalists, including thousands of formerly enslaved people who had gained freedom through British service, faced an uncertain future. Many were resettled in places like Nova Scotia under harsh, unequal conditions, while others were tragically returned to slavery. Native nations, excluded entirely from the peace negotiations, watched as their lands were divided up between colonial powers without their consent, setting the stage for generations of continued conflict and displacement. Slavery itself remained deeply entrenched even as a few states, like Vermont and Pennsylvania, began abolishing it during and after the war, and even as figures like Jefferson flirted with and ultimately abandoned proposals to limit its westward spread. The Revolution's promises of liberty and equality were never fully realized for everyone who fought for them. Yet the ideas it unleashed of self-government, individual rights, and the responsibility of each generation to expand those rights further proved far more durable than the war itself. As one contemporary observer put it, the war may have ended in 1783, but the revolution, the ongoing struggle to live up to its ideals, was far from finished.